the wake of Philadelphia Eagles wide receiver Desean Jackson resharing an anti-Semitic quote on his Instagram story this past week, the reaction's been swift in rightfully condemning the hateful words once delivered in a sermon by the Nation of Islam's Louis Farrakhan for what they are, anti-Semitic. However, no one's talking about the hypocrisy that exists when it comes to the critics, both Jewish and non-Jewish, who've used this as an opportunity to steer the re-education of the 33-year-old Jackson in a direction that isn't about combating anti-Semitism, but is about promoting apartheid Israel's Zionist ideology. New England Patriots wide receiver Julian Edelman, an ardent Zionist, has never once had to apologize for indirectly supporting the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians or the IDF's war crimes against the 2 million people trapped in the world's largest open-air prison, the Gaza Strip. Behold the irony of the Israeli flag on his cleats next to Stronger Than Hate for the NFL's annual My Cause, My Cleats week. The role of international influence peddler for Bibi Netanyahu's far-right Likud party From the Depths is the height of shamelessness. From the Depths was founded by Jonny Daniels. Daniels' pro-Israel lobby organizations weaponize the tragic legacy of the Nazi Holocaust responsible for the mass murder of millions of European Jews, gypsies, socialists, LGBTQ people, and dissidents of all kinds. They do this by advancing far-right politics while simultaneously speaking the language of human rights we are used to hearing from liberal NGOs. In the unfortunate case of Desean Jackson, they've deployed MAGA enthusiast and corrupt New Jersey real estate developer Edward Mosberg. And while it's true that Mosberg suffered horrors few can imagine at the hands of the Nazis and their collaborators in Eastern Europe, Daniels' organization uses him in a way that cheapens, not honors, the legacy of the Holocaust. Instead of never again to anyone, political Zionists make clear that they believe the takeaway is only never again to us. Let's take a look at a clip from Mosberg's appearance on evangelical fanatic Mike Huckabee's show.
Survived the Holocaust. How special was it to be at the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem? You and I were both there. I saw you there.
Yes.
What was that kind of moment to say, I survived the Holocaust, I'm now in the Jewish state of Israel that the Nazis tried to make sure would never happen, and I'm standing as the embassy is being declared in the ancient capital of Jerusalem?
I was very proud of it, and especially because you was there too.
Well, it was a joy, an electric occasion, to say the least. Edward, your story.
Can I say
yes,
one more thing?
Please.
Who is guilty for the Holocaust? I blame the German nation, because if they would not voted for Hitler at that time, there wouldn't be no Nazi, there would be no Holocaust. Okay? And one more thing. If President Trump would be at that time, he would bomb the crematoriums, he would bomb the railroad tracks leading, and try to save many millions of people. So God bless President Trump.
What stands out to me is Mosberg wearing his concentration camp uniform to plug for Trumpian politics and speak in glowing terms about having attended the opening of the illegally relocated U.S. Embassy to Israel in Jerusalem. The evidence of Israel's rogue state status is overwhelming and speaks for itself, as one of today's guests, Max Blumenthal, can speak to as author of the 2015 book, The 51-Day War, Ruin and Resistance in Gaza, which chronicles Israel's brutality against the people of Gaza in sobering detail. For 51 days in the summer of 2014, Israel executed Operation Protective Edge against the people of Gaza, during which Max compiled irrefutable evidence of Israel's aggressor status in the onslaught and war crimes so brazen they would shock even the most jaded of cynics. Power dynamics, rarely mentioned in Western media, favor Israel to such an extent that this carnage can only be characterized accurately as a conquest, not a conflict. Palestinians are even denied sovereignty over the territory that's ostensibly their own. According to the 1993 Oslo Accords, sovereignty without the right to form a military for the common defense is an illusion. And Israel has shown it will stop at nothing to prevent indigenous Palestinians from achieving equal democratic rights in their own homeland. Some democracy, huh? It's no wonder Netanyahu turns a blind eye to the blatant anti-Semitism of his neo-fascist Eastern European allies like Hungarian President Viktor Orban, just re-elected Polish President Andrzej Duda, and others. How could this be? It's simple. Strengthening political Zionism supersedes all other considerations. As long as a world leader supports Israel on the international stage, anti-Semitism in their own countries is at best a secondary concern. For Netanyahu, Jonny Daniels, Edward Mosberg, Michael Oren, and many others. The focus never was about, quote, coming together or building bridges. All right, Desean Jackson stepped in a major way. In the midst of a pandemic, all right, it sidelined live sports like we've never before seen in modern history. Consequently, Jackson's become a lightning rod, and deservingly so up to a point. But make no mistake, the PR offensive being led, advanced by the far-right Israel lobby outfit from the depths, is cynical opportunism wrapped up in the woke language of post-George Floyd anti-racist discourse. The idea that Jackson, a black man from Compton, needs to learn about anti-Semitism from those who enthusiastically support the racist policies of Trump and Netanyahu is offensive, to say the least. There are countless Jews, academics, intellectuals, and religious leaders he could meet with and learn a great deal from. So why is it that Jonny Daniels and Edward Mosberg have prominent roles in the re-education and reformation of Desean Jackson? One thing is for certain, we should hold up the NFL's people's champs of our time who made it clear they wouldn't be used as propaganda pawns in early 2017 when, according to the Electronic Intifada, in the wake of the season in which Colin Kaepernick gave birth to the Take a Knee movement, then Seattle Seahawks defensive end Michael Bennett, his brother, then New England Patriots tight end Martellus Bennett, then Miami Dolphins wide receiver Kenny Stills, and then Denver Broncos running back Justin Forsett, each followed Michael Bennett's lead in dropping out of fully paid for propaganda trips to Israel. While it's true that with Trump as president, Israel has as much cover as it's ever had to press ahead with brazenly illegal moves like the annexation of the West Bank and the ever-worsening horrors within Gaza's borders due to Israel's unrelenting medieval-like siege that renders the world's largest open-air prison, the Gaza Strip. But the short term is entirely different from the long term PR war for hearts and minds around the world. And it's one that Israel is clearly losing. Look no further than the dramatic drop in US public opinion on Israel for evidence. Take, for example, responses to this question. Do you view Israel favorably or unfavorably? According to YouGov polling data cited by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, in 2015, 47% of Americans described Israel as, quote, an ally. In 2017, the number was down to 41%. And in 2018, and in a 2018 poll, that is, the figure is even lower at 37%. Now consider age, race, and ethnic distinctions, and the views of Americans on Israel become even more revealing. Only 25% of those 18 to 29 years of age said that Israel was an ally, compared to 55% of those over 65. 43% of whites viewed Israel as an ally, compared to only 19% of African Americans and 22% of Hispanics. These numbers certainly bring into context a paradoxical reality of our times. Israel's ethnocratic Zionist ideology being both as strong and as weak as ever. All right. Now I want to bring in my co-host of Redspin Sports, Michael Sampson, with the Jacksonville Community Action Committee, where they've been working to develop a police accountability council that can bring real teeth to actually convicting and bringing charges and convicting killer cops, such as what you saw in Minneapolis and all over the country. Be something such as Civilian Police Accountability Review Board that could have real teeth. So he's been actively working on that, and we're excited to have Mike back today. Also, we have Max Blumenthal with us today, co-host of Moderate Rebels podcast, editor of the Grayzone, a best-selling author of multiple books, The Management of Savagery, and especially pertinent to today's discussion, Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel. We're going to be looking at basically the NFL and apartheid Israel and their unholy alliance, and really the abysmal treatment that mainstream media is given to this, not so much the Desean Jackson story, that was, there's no way to put it, the words were anti-Semitic, but the issue we're really looking at here is the aftermath of it and how it's been spun, and how this sort of network of Israel lobbyists have sort of come in here and tried to develop a way to get into, and really define the way that he needs to become reformed and learn from this and what that kind of thing means. So as we know, the anti-Semitism is constantly exploited by Israel lobby to try to promote their interests and not to really look at issues of real anti-Semitism, and as evidenced by people like Viktor Orban in Hungary and what goes on in Poland and whatnot. So really, we're here to analyze the larger issues and try to bring context to them in a way that'll help make sense. So Mike and Max, glad to have both of you here.
We're going to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you. Mike, how's it going in Jacksonville?
It's been busy, man. Just happy to be here. Happy to be back on.
All right.
Things have been, politics and sports the past couple of weeks. They've been explosive like we haven't seen in a long time.
No doubt, no doubt. So we're going to get into a little clip here. A lot of people have seen it on the internet. Julian Edelman from the New England Patriots, wide receiver, made an Instagram video appealing to Desean Jackson after his, what they were anti-Semitic remarks. But nonetheless, his response, this is a guy who's gone to Israel multiple times, whitewashes apartheid, wears his Israeli baseball cap in the locker room, does all these action adventure stuff over there, and really is a very useful propaganda tool in a situation where Zionist and Zionism is losing sort of an international PR battle now. So they've really seized this opportunity, and is not a surprise at all to people who follow the Grayzone and follow people that cover media critically. We've seen a terrible kind of contextualizing of what this all means and what it should mean. So Max, I want to kick it over to you now. Kind of what were your, before we get into the video real quick, just in general, like anything you want to say to start this off? Or?
Well, I think one of the most important things when you're watching these videos, actually, you showed them to me. I knew Bob Kraft, the owner of the Patriots, was bringing players over on these trips, and I'd seen, photos of Tom Brady with soldiers, but I didn't know how truly insane and mind-altering some of this footage was, and some of these experiences these players were having was.
Right.
I think it's really important to understand that the Israel lobby in the United States sees Black Americans and Latinos as a threat. They see them as the least supportive of Israel, the most likely to see their own experience and the experiences of Palestinians. And they're seeking ways of lobbying them through, for example, Christian Zionist, implanting Christian Zionist narratives into Black churches. You've seen the Israeli former ambassador to the U.S., Ron Dermer. I think he might still be ambassador, going to, Baptist churches in Atlanta where Martin Luther King used to preach at, to pay tribute to King. We've seen, Latino leaders from the National Council of La Raza and other kind of corporate NGO type organizations be given free trips to Israel. Then they come back and the American Jewish Committee has them sign, message like letters of solidarity, pledging to work together to counter anti-Semitism and to fight for immigrants. And countering anti-Semitism in this world means standing up for Israel. And it's the same, at AIPAC. I did a video on AIPAC several years ago, and while I was documenting what was going on outside the DC Convention Center where AIPAC was being held, the biggest gathering of the Israel lobby annually, I was meeting all of these student presidents from historically Black colleges and universities who had been flown out there without knowing really much about Israel and just offered a free trip to Washington and the ability to network with people. And I was asking them about Palestinians and the whole crisis, and they were sort of, it was like talking to deer in the headlights. It was really sad. And they'd been flown out through the Saban Fellows program. Haim Saban, this pro-Israel billionaire who funded Obama and Hillary. He's a Democrat. He was paying their way. So this is part of this. I mean, what you're going to see in these videos with these players is, part of lobbying professional athletes who are predominantly Black and giving them kind of biblical narratives and completely ignoring and disappearing Palestinians from the picture.
Right. Appreciate it, Max. Mike, I want to pitch it over to you real quick before we get into the Edelman video, because I think you've had experiences that you probably have a lot to react to in terms of what Max just said. So why don't you just pick it up there?
No, it kind of goes on the Malcolm X had a criticism of the Israel lobby back in when you had the original formations of the African Union. It was, I believe it was called neo-dollarism. He phrased it how the Israel lobby at that time with emerging African nations was using that as an opportunity to extend aid, to give a lot of, the hand of friendship in the event that, these would be the particular partners for the Israel lobby in the future to move forward and push forth their plans to expand as part of the greater Israel plan, of course, which includes, continuing to colonize nations around the state of Israel. So this is part of a greater strategy that has been in existence with the Israel lobby for decades. And as Max brought up, these HBCU presidents, the Israel lobby has identified that these historically Black university student government leaders will potentially become the next, Black House of Representative reps, so the Black senators or Black politicians who have a huge influence in the Black community. So the better way to get the Black people aligned with the agenda of the Israel lobby is to buy off their leadership, or is to get their leadership around the same kind of line of argumentation and flying them out to AIPAC conferences on the dime, and just so they hear the Israeli lobby perspective before they actually hear about the plight of the Palestinian people. One big example of that is Bakari Sellers. He was actually an SGA president at Morehouse University when he was approached by AIPAC and those representatives. And now, what do you see now? He's one of the biggest cheerleaders on CNN for the Israeli lobby and their continued oppression of the Palestinian people. So this has been a strategy that's been utilized by the Israeli lobby for decades. They know the power of the Black voice here in the United States of America, and the better way to kind of neutralize that threat and to kind of neutralize oppressed people like Black people and Palestinian people all coming together to kind of push back against U.S. imperialism and its proxies in Israel is to get that support from the Black politicians and kind of, in a very weird way, sort of make sure that these Black politicians like a John Lewis or other Black elected officials support the agenda of the Israeli lobby and don't show that solidarity with the Palestinian people. Like, if Black people and Palestinian people were all showing solidarity together, we could have a huge impact on pushing back against U.S. The imperialist project of the United States, as well as the Israeli lobby.
Right. You could even speak to there's been plenty of examples, both of you know about, of Black politicians, Black leaders who have taken that stand and they've paid the price for it in a major way, even if it's not, a stand that we would consider radical, but just even mild. It just shows the complete and utter control that, the AIPAC and the other arms of the Israel lobby has over the government. Bakari Sellers, I hate to admit on a personal note, when I was at the University of South Carolina, was a 22-year-old state representative that I had a chance to. His father was my professor, the kind of legendary Cleveland Sellers from SNCC, and it really breaks my heart to see the kind of trajectory his son has taken. But nonetheless, he has, and he's made those choices for himself. So anyways, we're going to go ahead and real quick go ahead and check the Julian Edelman video out, and then on the back end, we'll react. So
I've been getting hit up by everyone asking me about this Desean Jackson post, and I wanted to take some time before I responded because it's a complicated issue, and I wanted to be thoughtful. I wrote down some of my thinking. I've seen Desean play in his career, make outstanding football plays. We've communicated over social media. I've got nothing but respect for his game. I know he said some ugly things, but I do see an opportunity to have a conversation. I'm proud of my Jewish heritage, and for me, it's not just about religion. It's about community and culture as well. I'm unusual because I didn't identify as Jewish until later in my life. Whenever I encountered hatred, it never really felt like it was aimed at me. It was only after I was part of this community that I learned how destructive hate is. Anti-Semitism is one of the oldest forms of hatred. It's rooted in ignorance and fear. I remember experiencing a little bit of this hate in 2011 when I was called a kike on the football field. There's no room for anti-Semitism in this world. Even though we're talking about anti-Semitism, I don't want to distract from how important the Black Lives Matter movement is and how we need to stay behind it. I think the Black and Jewish communities have a lot of similarities. One unfortunate similarity is that they are both attacked by the ignorant and the hateful. It's really hard to see the challenges a community can face when you're not part of it. So what we need to do is we need to listen, we need to learn, we need to act. We need to have those uncomfortable conversations if we're going to have real change. So to that end, Desean, let's do a deal. How about we go to DC and I take you to the Holocaust Museum, and then you take me to the Museum of African American History and Culture. Afterwards, we grab some burgers and we have those uncomfortable conversations. This world needs a little more love, compassion, and empathy. Take care.
The thing that really stuck out at me there is he's wearing a hat that says Jew. Does it say Jets or Jew?
JE11. That's his brand that he sells.
It looks like his hat
for.
Says, okay, man. It looks like his hat says Jew.
Well, maybe he's going for a little double entendre there, with
it's weird. And then he's got, the Magen David, the Star of David necklace on, and he's really playing up his Jewish identity. He says he came to being a Jew later in life because, honestly, in Jewish American culture, there's this reverence for any Jewish athlete they can find because there aren't that many Jewish professional athletes.
Hank Greenberg from the Detroit Tigers was lionized.
Yeah, there used to be because Bob, there used to be in the days of Bob Cousy in the NBA when Jews were coming in the country and they still lived in packed urban settings and they were, more blue collar. But, in my family, people started going to college and, business or whatever. And that's been the American Jewish experience. So there aren't that many Jewish athletes and he's one of the few in the NFL. So he, by playing up his Jewish identity becomes a marketing point and Jews all become, super worshipful of him. But, the most absurd thing about what he said, aside from the kind of equation of the situation of white Jewish people in the U.S. with the Black American condition or situation, which is just a completely ignores power relations, is that he invites Desean Jackson to go to the Holocaust Museum, and then he pledges to go to the Museum of African American History, as if the Holocaust Museum is a museum of Jewish history, when it's not. There was a conscious decision made, a political decision that was made to not have a museum of American Jewish history, which would have been awesome because we've made so many achievements in this country and accomplished so much and contributed so much to the culture, and to instead have this kind of monument to Jewish genocide that occurred thousands of miles away in Europe. And that institution has been heavily politicized. As I wrote in a recent piece about Syria, their Committee on Conscience is filled with neoconservative warmongers like Elliot Abrams, who's a straight up Iran-Contra felon. And the museum has been used as a forum to push sanctions on Syria. So Edelman is offering Desean Jackson a heavily politicized experience where, Jewish culture will be seen through the framework of genocide, whereas African American culture, while slavery is acknowledged in that museum, is, he's going to experience it in its totality, and it won't be that striking to him, especially, when you're a pro athlete and you're around Black Americans all the time, you kind of learn some things about the culture anyway. So really, this is just about disciplining Desean Jackson. He's not offering anything from his own side.
Right. And just sort of I just thought I got to pop in because it's like with Desean Jackson, look, what he said is anti-Semitic. There's no doubt about it. But let's just try to look at the context. And I know there's going to be some people that will accuse me of like, oh, even doing that is unforgivable. You hear all the people saying he, quoted Hitler, right? And they just kind of repeating that as if like he consciously gets on there and just decides, I'm going to like find an Adolf Hitler quote and just share it. Because, that's a good headline for our mainstream media, our clickbait media. All right. They want that. Desean Jackson likes Hitler. Right. I mean, it's a joke. I think it was from a sermon that Farrakhan gave. And it's like a lot of people in this time of like this pandemic and being locked down and routines obliterated are like trying to learn more things. Like, I mean, Mike, you played ball at a high school inner city high school in Jacksonville, similar, our same hometowns. And there's a lot of athletes that grow up in the jock culture that, being an intellectual is not really a thing. And Desean Jackson is like grew up in Compton, California and LA. And, I'm not making assumptions that he's not smart, but I'm just saying that like he might be diving in, trying to explore things. Right. And he made a mistake. Right. But this whole analogy, the way they just it's being framed as if the oppression of American Jews is analogous, like within this country, to the Black American experience of national oppression. And the look at the stats, just mass incarceration, the way interactions with police, housing. I mean, all these different metrics. It's not even an opinion, right? I mean, Jews have obviously been treated horribly, like historically in Europe, pogroms, anti-Semitic pogroms, the Nazis, horrific stuff. But like this equation, as if it's like, oh, well, let's just both see how we're oppressed. Like, I mean, it's problematic to say the least. And Mike, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to steal your role.
No, I think it's very, when you look at it, who's responsible for, let's say, the anti-Semitic shootings that have been happening. It's been white nationalists who also support Donald Trump in the White House and U.S. imperialist projects. Who's responsible for the slaughter of like African Americans and Black people and racist policies? It's the same kind of ruling class that it was responsible for perpetuating anti-Semitism in this country. So Desean Jackson is not a part of that. Individuals, like you said, when you have folks who have, let's say, a criticism of the power structure and have this innate issue with like how society is running, of course they'll go to sources and knowledge bases. I mean, that's why 25% of the country believes that the Illuminati is the ruling force that kind of just, that runs the country, you know what I mean? Or believes in all these different conspiracy theories. And of course, these conspiracy theories aren't true, but it just reflects a yearning for knowledge from people like a Desean Jackson who, what he said was definitely inappropriate. I wouldn't have definitely Instagrammed that. I mean, and, he's dealing with the consequences of that, I guess, right now. But like you said, it's kind of a false equivalency that exists that, kind of has to be struggled through. And what, of course, the Zionist lobby is using that as an opportunity to possibly recruit Desean Jackson into the ranks, so he can be the one that's putting forth that narrative that they want to put out. I mean, you've had politicians like Ilhan Omar, as well as even the Black Lives Matter Network founders being accused of anti-Semitism, or famous Black activist Malcolm X and others who've always been accused of anti-Semitism due to their
Danny Glover, Harry Belafonte.
There's due to their solidarity with the Palestinian people. So anytime you show solidarity with the Palestinian people, you're going to get that charge from the Israeli lobby as being anti-Semitic, even though the Palestinians are also Semitic peoples. But that's the problem that we have in this country. There's been this delusion of identity to form the narrative of the imperialist project in the same way that, white national identity is used to fuel, let's say, the U.S. imperialist project. In a lot of ways, that has been co-opted by the Zionists, even with Jewish identity, to really fuel the Israeli project of imperialism and expansion into neighboring Arab land. So we've seen that narrative, and we just have to continue to combat it because it's just a silly one.
And in a contemporary tone, we hear so much like, what is it now? The big thing, White Fragility, this book that's been like so widely read in this country. And then now it's like being criticized, essentially reducing race to, I think it's why, Max, I think I was down in DC, and I think we were reacting like to when we were seeing all these people in Bethesda, Maryland, like, I am like we will come together and be good white allies and listen. It's like, now I get it. They all read that book. And what it is a lady who's gotten rich off of selling a corporate PR racket type narrative that you fight racism in an individualistic kind of way. So it doesn't threaten like their existence, like their privilege, you want to speak like that, or, any sort of class dynamic. So
I don't want to get off topic too much, but that was a pretty wild scene. It was at Connie Morella High School, which is named for a moderate Republican in one of the most affluent districts of the DC suburbs. And they, all of these white people got on their knees and put their hands up and atoned for their racial sins against Black people. That was their, contribution to the moment of the George Floyd. I don't know if Black people were asking for that, but that's what.
Mike, were you asking for that?
Like a religious ceremony.
No, whatever. Yes, it was doing a bit too much. That's not.
Anyway, so as Max said, unless you have anything else, let's get back on track. But I think it is relevant, though. That's just a perfect example of just why it ties into why our culture is so reacts to something like Desean Jackson. Why we could have a discourse that's actually meaningful, but instead it's nothing but Julian Edelman and him meeting with Edward Mosberg, who we'll get to in a minute. But Max, what were you gonna say?
We had a similar incident here in Ward 8 in Southeast DC, which is the most still monolithically Black district or ward in a city that was traditionally Black, but which is now the most gentrified city in the country. And our council member, Trayon White, who was a sort of disciple of Marion Barry, he's been getting kind of involved with the Nation of Islam. It's kind of, tragic but that's kind of like one of the only organic resistance movements to the power structure in DC that actually has penetration down here, where people actually know about it and they respect Farrakhan. And he went on Facebook and said something about the Rothschilds creating a weather machine. It was really like a bizarre rant. And he wasn't specifically naming Jews, but then he came under this kind of insane communal discipline from self-appointed Jewish leaders. He was a rabbi from the suburbs, or not from the suburbs, but from a wealthy district in DC, broke into a city council meeting and just started screaming at him and accusing this young Black man of threatening his life and threatening to kill Jews and putting his family in danger. It was the most obscene overreaction. And you see, anytime a Black communal leader or celebrity goes off base a little bit, whether it's on the issue of Jews and they do something absurd like Trayon did or Desean Jackson did, or they express solidarity with Palestinians, their overreaction is in itself racist and bigoted. And there's this sense that Jewish communal leadership, which represents one of the most affluent, educated groups in the country, has the unlimited right to condescend and teach and discipline and punish these sort of marginalized young, usually black men and women. And it's just so ugly, and you can't even say anything about that. And just another thing that I was noticing today was a hashtag appeared, and I don't know if it was in reaction to the whole Desean Jackson incident or not, but it was hashtag Jewish privilege. And all of these Zionists and liberal Jews as well got together and started trying to push back against this hashtag by tweeting about incidents of discrimination, whether it was, Sarah Silverman saying her grandfather experienced, brutality in Europe, or comedians saying, well, I shouldn't talk about my Jewish identity. I was told that I wouldn't get gigs because that doesn't work here. And I'm like,
what, comedians?
No. Yeah, I saw some comedians saying that, and they trended the hashtag in reverse so that they were denying that Jewish privilege exists. Let's just face the fact. I'm privileged because, number one, I'm white. I mean, the Jewish experience in the U.S. is we're insiders and we're outsiders because, we're part of a group that isn't, WASP, white Christian, but we are basically a privileged group. We're super educated now. We're very generally wealthy as a community. And we have a second country that we have no actual connection to that we can go to, and we can displace Palestinians at will. In fact, Sarah Silverman's sister is a rabbi who lives in Jerusalem, I think in a home of a displaced, ethnically cleansed Arab family. So that's privilege. And in Israel, your privilege really is officially Jewish privilege. That's the essence of Zionism. But here our privilege is because we're white. So we have to constantly recognize the power imbalance. And when, even liberal American Jews try to deny their privilege, they create the opportunity for these kind of disgusting, very disturbing scenes where Black Americans who come from communities where there is no access to education or wealth are punished in a sadistic manner by Jewish communal leadership. And it only recreates and generates more anti-Semitism.
Right. So, wait, Mike, if you could, I know you're gonna jump in, but you have that map behind you, and I think that's powerful. A map of it shows the Deep South, and people hear this concept of the Black Belt South, right? And what they think. I think some people probably think, oh, that means Black people. I mean, it technically means the richness of the soil, and those areas of darkness you see behind Mike's head there correspond to the highest growing, the most fertile soil for cotton, which not coincidentally are the most heavily Black populated counties of Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia there. And that really, slavery and transatlantic slave trade created when you think of at what a nation is, a sense of shared language and culture and a lot of characteristics that make up a nation. There is an oppressed nation of Black Americans that hail from there. There's a diaspora too in places like Chicago, New York, LA, all over. But maybe you could speak to that a little bit, because I think there's a lot of confusion on nationalism, especially on the left. People are afraid to talk about it. But I think we do need to talk about the distinctions between oppressive imperialist nationalism, settler colonial nationalism we see in Israel, and what we saw in South Africa, versus oppressed nationalities like Palestinians and African Americans in the United States today. And if you could, I don't know, whatever you wanted to say before that is fine, but I was hoping maybe you could give a little context on that.
Yeah. I mean, let's go back to even a couple of years ago in Florida. We had, there was a politician, state senator by the name of Dwight Bullard. He actually went on a delegation to Palestine with an organization here called the Dream Defenders, in which, it was a Palestinian-led delegation. He actually lost his seat because the Zionist lobby was throwing all this BS at him, claiming that, the tour guide he was with was a former member of the PFLP and he was palling with terror, shit like that, bullshit like that. He actually lost his seat. And the Zionist lobby really united to push him out of office due to him showing support for Palestinian people and doing that delegation. Even here in Florida with the last gubernatorial election, there was an African-American man named Andrew Gillum who ran for governor. And he was actually, with the Dream Defenders, he was actually very supportive of the Dream Defenders when they first started, secure funds for them to get the first action in Sanford, supported them in the Capitol.
And that was in the wake of Trayvon Martin's murder.
In the wake of Trayvon Martin, yeah. So the governor of Florida now, Governor Ron DeSantis, I don't know if you've ever read his history of being close to the Israel lobby. I mean, he did a cabinet meeting in Israel last week. The Florida cabinet did a meeting in Israel last year for a week. And as well, they have this scientific partnership that he's literally pushed forth with Florida universities with Israel. So you have Israeli universities that have programs in Florida public colleges and vice versa. And the crazy part is they actually pushed out the Chinese exchange program at a local university in Jacksonville in exchange.
That's so fitting for this time we're in right now.
It is fitting for the time, but like I was talking about, that gubernatorial race, that was a charge that the Zionist lobby labeled against Andrew Gillum as well. This young Black, he's a Democrat, centrist Democrat, but he would have been the first Black governor of Florida, and he was labeled as anti-Semitic, even though he also stood against the BDS movement.
He enthusiastically supports Israel.
he does, you know what I mean? But he wasn't to the liking of, because of his association with this Black liberation youth group that supports the Palestinian cause. I mean, and especially in the South, in the Black Belt, like you was talking about, Atlanta being one of those states, AIPAC lobby targeting Morehouse, targeting Clark Atlanta University, targeting these historically Black universities, which are based in the South, to really target those young emerging Black leaders who will support the Zionist lobby and all their future plans. So it's a very calculated strategy that's been put into place and has been working for a long time. But I also think the Zionist lobby is on their last leg, which is why they have to use these acts like Desean Jackson sharing, like a pretty shitty Instagram post, but ballooning that to be like, oh, we're in a time of Black Lives Matter. What about all these other lives and all this shit? Like, y'all don't give a shit about, what I mean? Like, that's the narrative that they're pushing to try to use this moment in time to really support the agenda of the Zionist lobby.
Absolutely. And just quickly about the Black Belt Nation, like, I mean, what that is, and like kind of like any connections or parallels you might see with like the Palestinian struggle.
Oh, for sure. Like, it's our condition is a Black Belt. This is where you have the highest concentrations of African Americans in the nation. Up to 50% of the African Americans who live in this United States live in the Black Belt South, in the South. And this is also where you have large counties of a majority African American population who have also been disenfranchised from the land. There's no coincidence that in the South is also where you have the most Confederate statues existing. It's kind of like, I kind of compare it to, Dylan Roof. He was the white supremacist mass murderer who shot into that church and murdered a lot of African American people in Charleston. Well, he had two flags. He had the Confederate flag and he had the Rhodesian flag. Of course, Rhodesia was the white settler state before Zimbabwe, before they had their liberation movement. So one can literally see that the Confederacy wasn't in fact that type of state, a very racist, minority ruled kind of state that used the most egregious amounts of oppression to keep slaves in line. And even after the fact, you had radical reconstruction, which was going to be actually the creation of a new, of a democratic nation in the United States, and especially in the South, of a Black nation. You saw what's the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, and you saw the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, which assured that the Klan and all these former racist landowners who fought for the Confederacy could come back into power, and they've been running the South ever since. Through Jim Crow and through all these slave codes and all these other legislation. So the similarities to that with the Palestinian struggle is very much there, which is why, as a Black person myself from the South, I show solidarity with the Palestinian struggle and what they go through, because we are a part of an oppressed nation that hasn't gotten liberation, which is why, and our leadership in a lot of ways, similar to maybe in Palestine, has been bought off by the Zionist lobby in a lot of ways that folks would, in part of the Palestinian movement, would also say has existed. So that's why we stand in solidarity with each other. And that's why there's a huge emerging, and especially in the past 5 years, of this Black and Arab Palestinian solidarity, which has grown so much in the last couple of years, because Black people are becoming more knowledgeable to the oppression that other oppressed nationalities are facing worldwide. And we're kind of seeing that the same enemy that oppresses us and murders us on the streets of Chicago, Atlanta, Jacksonville is also using the same weapons, the same prison companies, the same tanks that are oppressing Palestinians in Palestine, in occupied Palestine.